Dr. Price, one theory we've heard is that the writers of the Gospel were saying, via their literary figure of Jesus, that the Jews deserved the fate that befell them. The destruction of the Second Temple, etc., because they were worshiping the wrong God. They were fixated on the tribal God and nasty demiurge Yahweh, when they should have been devoted to the high God. The high God sent a salvific angel figure to save them, Christos. But the Jews failed to recognize or accept the Christos, and that's why the high God withdrew his favor from the Jews and let the Romans destroy the Second Temple. It was devoted to Yahweh, the wrong God. Deuteronomy does show that the Jews originally conceived of their Lord, all capitals, as a tribal god, amongst other tribal gods, and not as the high God. What do you think? Was the Gospel an allegory about the Jews worshiping the wrong God, Yahweh?
Well, again, it depends on what he means by the Gospel, the primitive or the primordial gospel narrative.
What about any gospel? Do you think that there any of the gospel in the canon, maybe, or any gospels, period, that teach this idea?
Well, Matthew probably does. When Pilate is trying to get him to, the whole situation is absurd, as if he'd be bullied by a bunch of roustabouts in the alley. Well, tell Caesar on you. Get out of here. But it's like he has to try to convince them to let Jesus go. He needs their permission. And finally gives in and says, okay, this is on you, not me. And he washes his hands to show I'm clean of any responsibility here. And the Jews, as if they're chanting in unison, say, his blood be on us and on our children. Well, the way that's usually interpreted, it does seem to imply that what punishment are they talking about that would come to them and their children? It sounds like they're allowing about 40 years until the something is going to happen, and of course it would be the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But that doesn't say anything about it being the wrong God. Again, Huller in this book about Jesus as a Samaritan, he comes up with the idea that Jesus as a Samaritan believed essentially that Jerusalem was devoted to a different God some way, but that they believed the rituals of the temple would keep the world going. And so the Samaritans said, well, that's true, but we will stop the temple ritual, and that's what Jesus was doing with the cleansing of the temple, so that the world will end. That it was like forcing the apocalypse. Again, I got to get this manuscript out and read it. It's been over a decade since I've read it, but Huller is eccentric, but unbelievably learned. And I always have to seriously evaluate what he says. He's just very stimulating to read. So maybe he has insight into this approach, but I don't. By the way, I think that may not be the intent of Matthew. I used to think, well, obviously it is. It's sad that it's in there because people are using it as an excuse for anti-Semitism. But of course, that's also a misreading because it's just talking about them and their children to tell you when God's going to lower the boom on Jerusalem. It's not saying all Jews. But I think you can even go farther. That language, his blood be on us and on our children, this seems to me to echo what happens when Moses offers the Torah to Israel and sprinkles it and the congregation with blood. And they say something like, may the blood of the covenant be on us, and all that. And I thought, is this, I mean, Matthew definitely sees Jesus as a new Moses and the founder of a new covenant. And in light of that, I have to wonder if he's not depicting the Jews buying into the covenant somehow, the new covenant. I mean, I don't know how that would fit in, but I think it's worth further thought.
Or at least a mimetic, some type of mimetic connection, even if the connection is opposite. Whereas in Moses' day, it seems like they're accepting. Here, it's like they're almost, in a way, denying, but it's a ritual that's still be going on there. I find it interesting in Matthew 2. I wanted to rabbit trail with this idea. Not so sure either whether or not this is saying you guys are worshiping the wrong God, but I listened to a lecture on that long drive from Washington State from a scholar who was talking about replacement theology concepts in Matthew. And, people from the East and the West will be seated, but pretty much the children of Abraham aren't. It's this weird idea that, he can even make children of Abraham from these stones. Like, it doesn't matter. And the covenant's ending with his people. Almost like a new covenant's coming. But what is that new covenant? Is that new covenant with the children of Abraham? The descendants anymore? Like, almost like he's cutting out the whole, what it meant to be part of this thing. And Matthew does some really radically strange things that make me kind of wonder, what the heck is going on? So, I don't know if that plays any part in this, but...
Well, think of the parable of the wicked tenants, when he says, they thought they could claim squatters' rights if they killed the guy's heir. And he says, well, in the same way, God is going to take the kingdom from you and give it to another nation who'll prove worthy of it. That sure sounds like Gentile supersessionism. And though some say, well, who's the you? It doesn't say all Jews. It may just mean the temple leadership is corrupt,
right?
Which sounds a little like an evasion to me, but it's not really out of the question. That could make sense.
I think the scholar was trying to suggest that Matthew is clearly indicating later idea, or at least some type of hints to this must be later than you think, because they're already conceiving the notion that descendant of Israel, like the idea of Jews, is not even needed. It's not even part of the picture anymore. In fact, there's this scholar suggesting, and he says, if it was just one argument I was making, okay, I get why or even two, I get why we would be a little reluctant. He says, one thing after another gives this idea of replacing Israel with a new type of people, and these new people are Gentile, like anyone, a much broader perspective that Matthew is taking. And I don't know if that's all the way throughout Matthew.
Well, look at the Great Commission at the very end of it. Go to the nations and make disciples, baptize them, and all that stuff. That's the Great Commission. Matthew has kept the not-so-great commission in chapter 10, which must have been a rival programmatic statement where he sends disciples, and he never actually did. Of course, it was the Jewish commission with their mission. You're not going to have time to get through all the villages of Israel before the Son of Man appears. So if they persecute you in one town, don't waste your time, go on to another one. And this was the commission of the Jewish Christians, like in Acts 10 and 11, when they hear that Peter preached to a Gentile. Say, are you out of your mind? And he says, look, I felt the same way, but let me tell you what happened. And they hear and they say, son of a gun, God has opened the door of repentance even to the Gentiles.
I think that you hit the nail on the head. I don't think that can be emphasized enough. What I love about your specialty and your skill set here, Dr. Bob, is you look for the things that aren't said in the way that we want them to be said. These are not cleverly devised myths. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Make sure you know that. That tells me, son of a gun, these are someone's accusing you.
Yeah,
yes.
of course.
So
yeah.
what's going on with the Gentiles? Why are you devoting such chapters to it, in my opinion, unless there was earlier sects rivaling this? Someone saying don't go to Gentiles, someone saying they're not allowed in, someone's doing something. There's a reason you're devoting this time and documenting, hey, did you know that God gave the right to these guys now too? Whoa, ho, ho, ho. And there's conflict. So this is fascinating.
One of my favorite examples of that, again in Matthew, is right at the keynote sayings in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't think that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets, which means scripture, right? The law and the prophets, when they refer to it. I haven't come to abolish them. It's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for the jot or tittle of the law to perish. Therefore, whoever keeps even the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so, hint, hint, underline, he'll be number one in the kingdom of heaven. But anybody that goes around who doesn't keep them, and worse yet, tells others not to, he's going to be at the bottom of the ladder.
Anti-Pauline?
Yeah, or anti-Marcionite,
okay.
Which may be the same thing ultimately. Because, in other words, there are Christians saying that the achievement of Jesus was to get rid of the Torah, of the Jewish scriptures. Who said that? That's Marcion. No, we're going to need our own scriptures. It just seems to me that is a Marcionite element in that gospel. And who's breaking them and teaching others to? That's Paul or Marcion.
It would make no sense to say these are the Jews of the contemporary first century that are going on in the narrative, because first of all, yeah, you might have the Samaritans, or let's stop, the Sadducees. Okay, it can't be them. They still have the Torah.
Right.
Okay, they're not about the prophets and all, maybe, but they're about that Torah.
Yeah.
You can't say that the Pharisees are about it. They got the law and the prophets. They're like, give me both. So who the heck comes on the scene saying, I'm not worried about the law and the prophets? Nobody fits that candidate but Marcion in the way that you're describing it. And according to this scholar, who's obviously a historicist, so you can't throw him in the, can't go, well, I can't listen to this guy. He thinks Jesus may not have existed. No, this guy is like academically conservative in a sense, and he goes into Matthew and says, this stuff looks like serious replacement theology criticism going on here, and there's some serious things going on in Matthew that they just don't fit a first century narrative. Unless you think first century replacement ideas were going on, I don't see that happening. It's too soon in my opinion, but I don't know. I don't know any other outside extra biblical text that we have that can verify that, but here we have it with Marcion, Justin Martyr, and other people.
Well, there's there are different views. I did an article, one of my favorites, called Antioch's Aftershocks, and it deals with Galatians and Matthew and the implied differences between Peter or Cephas and Paul and James as we see them in Galatians, and taken and the high likelihood that Matthew was composed in Antioch, and because Matthew is trilingual, he quotes the Septuagint, the Aramaic and the Hebrew as needed, whatever fits his point best. And he must have been a scribe, because he's certainly talking about himself in chapter 13. He says, have you understood the parable? And they say, oh yes. And he says, okay, well, therefore, any scribe who is trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his store treasures old and new. Well, that has to mean he is a scribe trained for the kingdom of heaven, and that's how he has these Pesher interpretations in the beginning of the book. Oh, I know what it originally meant. Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I've called my son. Well, of course, that referred to the Exodus, but now there's a newly revealed truth, and Matthew is the only one that has Jesus and the Holy Family going to Egypt. So, Antioch was supposed to be a big missionary center, as we see in the book of Acts. So I think it's pretty clear that, I think it was Andrew Overman argued, that either Galilee or Antioch would have been the place of origin. And I argue that if you look close, you can see Matthew is a compromised document that embodies conflicting traditions, materials, etc., from all three perspectives. There are some Jamesian ones. We're not interested in the Gentiles. God will take care of them in his own time, in his own way. And what would be an example of that? In Matthew 23, you scribes and Pharisees, you crisscross land and sea in the pursuit of a single proselyte. But when you get him, you make him twice the son of the devil as you are. That's pretty rough stuff. That's the anti-Pauline, anti-Gentile mission business. The thing in chapter 10, the not so great commission, that would be an anti-Pauline thing. What about all the niceties of don't swear by the gold on the temple, or just the temple itself? Instead of swearing to God, you're not fooling anybody, but you're making these nice distinctions in a hair-splitting way. Well, that's James, the Pharisee, essentially. And Peter is made a star, but is knocked down. That kind of fits his reputation. And there's a great book called Peter in Matthew by a guy, I think a Lutheran, Arlo F. Now, N-A-U, where he says, if you look closely comparing Matthew and Mark, you'll see that Mark was anti-Petrine and shows up Peter as an idiot all the way through, but that Matthew mitigates every one of those things by omission or adding things and so on. And but that shows right there that Matthew can't be that early. It's gone through various stages of expansion and so on. Well, yeah, so Matthew seems to embody conflicting views. But among the Jamesian ones, what you're seeing is not so much a struggle against Judaism, period, but against what Neusner calls formative Judaism, the kind of reconsolidating of Judaism at the Yavna Sanhedrin at the end of the first century. And that's where they debated what ought to stay in the canon and various legal decisions. Well, if that's the leadership, those are the Pharisees that Matthew hates. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, there's no way you're getting into the kingdom of heaven. And the simple fact that he almost always changes kingdom of God to kingdom of heaven. That's the Jewish reticence to throw around the word God or the name Jehovah. And so you can kind of see different opponents there in the Gospel of Matthew. But I do see of course, the Pauline view would involve the supersession of Jews and Israel by the Gentiles converted during the Gentile mission. So these, rather than harmonize these conflicts, trying to come up with some paradigm of a consistent theology in Matthew, I think what we've got is a compromised document that you've got to have You got to satisfy different factions so that their view will be represented. And that's also why you've got gross contradictions in First Corinthians, because they're different Paulinists who have different opinions on women prophesying, on people eating food offered to idols, on remunerating your apostles, and tongues and gnosis and the resurrection, because they're trying to make a representative selection of these views and to claim Pauline authority. Well, I know you're claiming it, but two can play that game. I say Paul said this. That's the my teacher Darrell Dowdy pointed out that we're kind of used to seeing the synoptic gospels as collections of little bits and pieces, because often there's no real continuity, or the things are grouped together by subject, even if they're not consistent with one another. But when we recognize that, but when we're reading a Pauline epistle and find incoherence and contradiction, we start harmonizing. Well, maybe this way and that. Why don't we just recognize that it means the same thing in the epistles as it does in the Gospels? That you got bits and pieces crammed together like a scrapbook. And I think he's right.
Yeah, like how did these 7, or let's just play with the 7 even though it goes beyond that, how did these 7 come through untampered with? Did the final guys who got this say, all right, we have the untouchables? You know, it's taboo today, even with scholarship. Like, you got laughed at by airmen to even consider the things you thought. But, you know, to me, it's just kind of weird. How do we think that all this, how do we know, like, how can we know that someone didn't dabble in playing with these? You're suggesting that a lot of editing, which we asked this question before, how do we know what Paul wrote and what came later? You said you look at problems here, but you know you're asking a really good question. It's like, how did all the Gospels get messed with? How do we say that the letters get messed with? We see that stuff like this is happening, but we get to these 7 that everyone can go, all right, Paul wrote these. Okay, whew, Paul wrote these. And not think that someone edited. I mean, did the author who wrote these 7, did they write it and it looks like all 7 were written by the same guy? What makes them so sold that this is not patchwork as well? Is there a reason?
I think ultimately it comes down to Lutheranism, that Lutheranism is based on Romans and Galatians. The evangelical apologist Edward J. Carnell, in a book called The Case for Orthodox Theology, he said that, when you're studying the Bible, the New Testament interprets the Old. Then within the New Testament, the epistles interpret the Gospels. In other words, the epistles have justification by grace through faith. It's not that clear, the Gospels do. And within the epistles, Romans and Galatians interpret all the others, and for the same darn reason. And I think even in liberal Protestant theology, the fact that they feel compelled to rehabilitate Paul for the modern reader. Paul wasn't against women in authority. In fact, he names a woman apostle and this and that and the other thing. And this thing, let women keep quiet in church, that's an interpolation, which probably is. Paul wasn't anti-Jewish, and he didn't really teach justification by grace through faith, but Judaism did. And E.P. Sanders argues that you're really distorting Jewish writings. They didn't believe you had to earn your salvation, which is no doubt true, but he's pushing it.
Works of the law are required, though. It's, James says, tell me you were saved by your faith, I'll show you my faith. Or something like
through my works.
Yeah, through my works. And then Paul almost implies, or the pseudo-Paul in Ephesians implies to me, Yeah. Works will come. Don't get me wrong, but look, you got the cart before the horse. You know, you're not realizing who's carrying who.
Yeah.
This is obvious, but.
Of course, I don't think any one person did all the editing. Well, in one sense, yes. William O. Walker did a great book about the interpolations into the Pauline epistles, and there and elsewhere he asked the big question, why do we have no manuscripts of the New Testament until about 200 A.D.? Why is there that window, that blacked out period? And he says it's true that the manuscript tradition is pretty uniform. They're not glaring, radical differences between the manuscripts. Is possibly the best explanation for that during the 2nd century, somebody did put together an authoritative text. In Islam, they thought that, I think it was Uthman, the third caliph, was told that the various Muslims were debating from the Quran, but nobody could win because the copies didn't agree. And we don't, it's doubtful this happened, but just as a kind of a precedent. So he asked everybody to fork over their copies of the Quran, and he had scholars iron out the contradictions so that now you had a common playing field you could debate, and he gave new copies to everybody. I don't know if that happened or not, but Walker is basically saying that that's what happened with the New Testament, and that's why all the manuscripts pretty much agree. They must have come from a common archetype that was distributed. And so who would have put that together? And David Trobisch says that, well, we got a pretty good candidate in Polycarp of Smyrna. We know he hated Marcion. We know he tried to combat him. There's good reason to believe that he wrote the pastoral epistles, and that whoever wrote them interpolated the other epistles to make them orthodox, as Winsome Monroe argued very convincingly to me. And somebody edited Luke, and the same person who did that wrote Acts, and we know the anti-Marcionite agenda would have dictated the supplementation of the one gospel of Marcion with others. And Acts seems to have as its big rationale to show that Paul was not the only apostle, as Marcion said. We don't really know much about him, but at least there were others, and Peter and John anyhow. And so why are there these relatively insignificant epistles accredited to John, James, Peter, and Jude? Well, because we want to come up with whatever we can that might have stemmed from the other apostles. And this seems like the best way to explain why this edition that became canonical was put together, and by whom? Well, Polycarp is the obvious, though some have said Irenaeus, Polycarp's disciple. That's possible, but it looks like one guy did, but he didn't write it, or to be more consistent, he wrote some of it and edited some. But I'm convinced. I think that's just what happened.